All right. Hello, back again. Thanks for your comments and support of the channel. Today's lesson is on the backward pawn. Everybody knows what a backward pawn is, right? Right. Okay. The backward pawn is a pawn that, even though it has one or two pawns on the files next to it, so let's say, for instance, after this move right here, right, a pawn. Matter of fact, let's just get to an example, a backward pawn situation. Right, let's just make some moves here. Matter of fact, a good example is to come from the good old Sicilian defense right here. Okay, and let us say just for fun, we went into something like this. Okay, I know I messed it up. I was trying to get into this Sveshnikov. Could have went in the right way, but and then after d6. Okay, here is your backward pawn. Okay, so although it might have one or two pawns on its side, in this case there's only one pawn on the adjacent file, which is the E pawn. It's pretty much on its own because those pawns cannot protect it. So that's what makes it backwards. For instance, if this pawn was here, right, there's a pawn right next to it. It wouldn't be backward. Or if it was here, of course. This is what makes it a backward pawn. Is that even though there's a pawn right here on the E file, this pawn on the E file is of no use to that backward pawn on the D file. And in this case, there's no pawn here. If this pawn was on the C file like that, then the D pawn wouldn't be backwards. But if it were here, the D pawn would be backwards, even though you have two pawns on the adjacent files. Okay. Now let's speak about it a little more. Okay, so the theory is that a backward pawn, just in a static sense, is basically bad to have, right? Just looking at the position in just a snapshot, you don't normally want to have a backward pawn, right? We're not talking about compensation or anything like that. Backward pawn normally, right, is bad. Okay. Now, what makes the pawn weak? Like if we get into the esoteric nature of things, right? What makes it really weak? Well, it's the usually it's the square. Let's get rid of that graphic. It's the square in front of the backward pawn that really causes all the trouble. Okay? The square in front of the pawn is weak. Notice that in this case, right, in this sort of like Sveshnikov type position, white has the queen bearing down on d5. The E pawn is bearing down on d5, as well as this knight. Okay? All of these factors make it extremely hard for black to relieve himself of this weakness. And oftentimes, games will revolve around these type of weaknesses. Okay? So just to show a quick example. So like after e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, and this is what I should have did the first time. d6, bishop e2, e5. Right, this is like an old variation, like a Bolsovsky variation, I believe. But again, you have this backward pawn, and this is all theory. And we'll get into, well, if the backward pawn is bad, then why do you have these openings? Okay, let's look at another position where it can come up. This one from your favorite King's Indian defense. Not my favorite, but your favorite. Castle, knight c3, d6, e4, knight b d7, knight g e2, e5, castle, takes, rook e8, h3, knight c5, queen c2, a5, bishop e3, c6. Again, this is theory. This is old theory, but nevertheless theory. Notice how black willingly accepts the quote unquote bad backwards pawn here. All right. Now, back in the old days, and I'm talking about before World War II, the backward pawn, in the classical sense was just, persona non grata. Like you just don't accept backward pawns. But of course, as time goes on, there's a player that, you know, kind of plays in a way that seems to laugh at the theories of the time. And this is how all sciences and arts progress. Like if you look at art, there was one time where artists just drew what was in front of them. They were drawing a mountain scene, they just drew the mountains, and they wanted to make it as real as possible, and that was like the sign of a great artist. Wow, he draws so good, it looks just like a photograph. You know, it made it realism. Made things look as they are. You know, then guys like Picasso come along and Dali and people drawing in abstract forms, and that's considered art. So just like those things move along in science, you have certain theories. First you had Newton's theory of gravity, but then now you had Einstein's theory of relativity kind of supersede and add on to those things. You had Euclid's geometry, and then now you have non-Euclidean geometry, etc. So things move on. So it's the same with chess. Sorry for the long-winded explanation, but I get excited about these things. So here, the backward pawn back in the days of like Tarish, Nimzovich, it was like, man, that's bad, right? Just flat out, no exceptions. But of course, after World War II, you had the younger players coming up, the Russian school, Boleslavsky, Bronstein, these, dynamic players, and they started playing with the backwards pawn. And that's where you see the birth of the, King's Indian defense, especially in the Zurich 1953 tournament. You see many, many King's Indian defenses played, and these players were experimenting. And basically what they did to offset this quote unquote weakness of the backwards pawn was concentrating on the activity of the pieces. And if you notice, that's one of the main themes today in the King's Indian defense. There's a lot of lines where pawns are sacrificed, backward pawns are accepted. In other words, static weaknesses are accepted in order to gain some type of activity elsewhere. So instead of the old, stayed positions of, say, Queen's Gambit decline that would play, for years and years, players got tired of, a solid but passive position. I know I don't like getting ground down, in a 70 move Queen's Gambit exchange variation, right? Or exchange Slav, or something like that. So players search for more dynamic options. But of course, they realize that, hey, in order to get more dynamic options, I have to unbalance the position. In order to unbalance the position, I have to put my, self more at risk. And that's what you see. So when you see stuff like this, right? Yes, black's position is a bit compromised. We're here with A5. The B6 square has the potential to become weak. The D file, can become fall easily into white's hands. The D pawn is statically weak, but on the other hand, he has great activity for his pieces. And this is what players begin to understand, focusing on the dynamic aspects in order to offset these static weaknesses. So another point is that basically the job that the neighboring pawns usually would have to protect, their fellow pawns, adjacent to them, that job isn't taken over by the pieces. So now it's up to the pieces um, to help protect that pawn, right? In this case, the D pawn, and also to advance it. So what you often see, or what you should see when chess is played correctly, is you'll see both sides concentrating on the same square. So white playing to stop the advance, right? Normally a rook or something to come here. White playing to control this square, and I said stop the advance at first, but properly it's more proper to say control the square, because black can achieve the advance but then still lose control of the square at the end. So ultimately you're fighting for control of that square. Usually it entails stopping the advance, because usually the opponent won't advance unless he has control of the square. But the reason why it's not proper to say stop the advance is because sometimes a player might sacrifice, and so it looks like he's achieving control of the square. So he might advance, get the advance in, but then lose control of the square. So ultimately, as you can see in this position, white is trying to control d5, and black is trying to control d5 also, right? And he has to build up his forces in order to be able to do that. And again, this is very important. All right. And again, mentioning about the King's Indian. The King's Indian is, as we all know, very tactical in his character. And players like Nakamura, Radjabov, these attacking players love, the King's Indian. Kasparov. Notice how all the great King's Indian players, are noted attackers. All right. So they're willing to take on their static weakness. All right. Now, what's interesting is that when you contrast to the Sicilian, in that particular line, that not the Sveshnikov, but that Boleslavsky variation, is black takes on the same responsibility of having a backward pawn, but the positional element predominates. Okay. So now we're gonna go on and look at some examples. All right. Here's an old game between former world champion Vasily Smyslov and the American Dean of Chess Arnold Denker. This is an old game from Moscow 1946. So Smyslov began with e4, c5, knight c3. Now Smyslov used to be a great exponent of the closed Sicilian. And this is what we have here. Knight ce2, and that's the idea, is to, instead of bringing out the other knight, is so c3 can be used to kick the knight off. Knight just jumps back. I'm sorry, I messed that up. Knight ce2, d6. Black has to move, of course. c3, knight c6, and d4, and there it is. White gets his full center. And knight takes d4. Knight takes d4. Okay, I messed this up. Sorry. Gotta start that over. Okay, after c3, knight c6, d4, c takes d4. Sorry about that. C takes d4 was not played. That's what I played. That was a mistake I made. Knight takes d4 was played by Smyslov. Knight takes d4. Bishop takes d4. e5. And here we see our backward pawn coming up on the board. Bishop e3. Knight to e7. and we see that the knight comes to e7, and of course the castle. But instead of blocking at f6, idea is to strike with this move f5 at some point. Okay, that's one of the ideas. The other idea is, again, the idea of fighting for that square. Keep that in mind. And since you know that, this is why this bishop becomes e6. All right, everything is about getting this pawn to d5 and getting control of that square. So after bishop e3, knight e7, knight e2, castle, getting the kings all tucked away, and bishop e6. Okay, so we see the battles raging here. Queen d2, queen c7. This is a normal Sicilian type move here. Now Smysl makes a deep move here. Is rook fc1. All right. Now you might be saying, like, why is this move so important? Well, he's playing against d5 here. All right. And you say, well, how's he playing against d5? Well, he's preparing to move c4. Okay. And now, if, say, black tries to prevent that with b5, then he'll attack this pawn with a4 and say a6, and then just bring the rook back here to d1. Okay, and now there's this constant threat of opening up the a file. So after rook fc1, there's I'm sorry, I gotta go back. So after rook fc1, Denker played f5, which undermines this pawn. Okay, and he wants to open up the f file, of course, and create attacking chances down that file, also undermining this pawn, which also undermines white's control over the d5 square. So you can see how, although there's other subplots going on in the position, such as the opening up of the f file, you see that the main plot is this control and fight over d5 and this backward pawn. All right, that's like the whole story. So after f5, Smysl plays c4. So this pawn is being attacked, but he brings up another one. Again, it's all about this square. So f takes e4, and knight c3. Again, all about that square. Notice he didn't get, thirsty and grab this pawn right away. All right. So, for instance, bishop takes c4. I'm sorry. Bishop takes c4. Bishop takes e4 can be meant by a move like this. So he could have taken it, but he keeps it focused on this square d5, and that's what I wanted to emphasize, because this pawn's gonna fall anyway. There's no way to hold on to it. The tactic, however, I wanted to show you is, notice that this pawn is now unprotected. Bishop takes c4, right, can be meant by this move, knight takes e4, and then say if d5, and we have this move knight g5 here. Okay, and it's difficult for black to meet these threats. Of course, knight c5 is also possible. So instead of bishop takes here, there's that move, knight f5, knight takes e4, knight takes e3. Now, another option, of course, is knight d4. And of course, now bishop takes. It's possible. Alright, it gives black a little bit of play. Instead of giving up that bishop, Smyslov had in mind to play this move c5. And the idea is after d5, play knight g5 attacking the bishop. And then after bishop f7, for example, let's move f5, f4, undermining this piece right here. So Denker played a natural move. Knight takes e3, just obtaining the bishop here. Why not? Queen takes e3. h6 was played to keep pieces off the g5 square. And now rook d1. Notice the attack on the pawn now. And rook fd8. Again, the tactics here, if bishop takes c4, there's no reason for white to play knight d6. Instead, he can just play rook ac1. Okay, and this is very strong according to Smyslov. Again, Denker seen it. So rook d1 and rook fd8. Again, just keep focused on the struggle around these squares right here. Square in front of the backward pawn. If black can liberate himself by advancing or taking control of the d5 square, then he's all right. And many of you know this is one of the main themes of the Sicilian, and very important in these lines where black allows the backward pawn. Continuing on after rook fd8, rook ac1, again indirectly fighting for that square. If he was to try to advance, then he just would take. Rook ac8, b3 from Smyslov, b6, knight c3, and we can see that black has kind of lost his battle for this square, and therefore his game is deteriorating rapidly. Bishop d5, so now there's the blockade, and it's getting worse and worse. Okay, so now black is forced to basically give up the only piece that was properly contesting the d5 square. Alright, and notice these pawns being on dark squares, which means that black is now left with a bad bishop. His good bishop, which is on e6, is pinned, so now he has to give up his best piece. So after king h7, simply bishop takes e6, queen takes e6, and rook d3, rook c7, rook c d1, and again, you just see the clarity of everything here. And now with this square firmly under control, white now conducts a direct assault on the pawn there. Bishop f8. This forces some passivity of black. This bishop was already bad and just goes home. Rook d5, blockading the pawn, so there can't even be a sacrifice of it. Queen g4. Rook 1 d3 because some infiltration happening right here. And the idea here is after, say, knight takes d6, bishop takes d6, rook takes d6, and queen d1, rook d1, rook d1. Black has some counterplay here, and you do not want to allow unnecessary counterplay. So after queen g4, rook 1 d3. Another idea is after queen e6, if I'm sorry, after queen e6, there's queen d2, setting up what is known as a Alekhine gun, right, with the queen behind the two rooks. All of white's pieces are beautifully posted on the d file, attacking this pawn. Rook fd7, and then this is just a killer, just the levy is going to break now, and after bishop takes, and just simply knight takes c5, exploiting the pin. Okay, this pawn cannot afford to capture this knight because of the massive loss of material. So the rook 1 d3. Denker is just forced to shuffle around. Knight d6, and now the fruit is ripe, and Smyslov takes it. Okay, and I'll leave it right there. White has achieved his desire, and again, this is a perfect example of the siege against a backward D pawn in the Sicilian. Of course, black didn't play optimally, or he would have had maybe drew the game or something. But to demonstrate the lesson, it's important to show you a game like that where white pretty much gets his way in the position there. Needless to say, Smyslov went on to win the game in 52 moves. Let's look at another example. This game took place in Zurich, 1934, between strong Grandmaster Salo Floor with the white pieces and Yarner with the black pieces. So after c4, e5, knight c3, and often these type of setups end up in what is called the reverse Sicilian. So you have a Sicilian, but with white playing instead of black. And that is what we are headed for here. So knight takes d4, bishop b4, bishop g5, castle, rook to c1, rook e8, e3, knight e5, bishop e2, h6, bishop h4, knight g6, queen takes f6, castle. And notice too that in the reverse position, in the Sicilian on the black side, playing for these dark squares. When you're the black side of the Sicilian. Now on the white side, you're playing for the light squares. Right? At first, of course, you want the whole center, but at first you're playing for these light squares. So you can see the where the pieces are placed. And now you can understand why bishop takes f6 is also played, removing one of the defenders of the light squares, because black is trying to stop the domination of those squares with this bishop on b4, his rook here, and his knight here. So bishop takes f6 eliminates that. But let's keep going. So after castle, now black continues his fight and contestation of these squares. He eliminates that knight. D6, knight B5, queen D8. The rook drops back to C1, bishop D7, knight C3, bishop C6 from yonder, and knight D5 from floor. And this is a classical demonstration of using the outpost. Right here we see the outpost right here on D5 with the support of the C4 pawn. And one of the reasons of setting up an outpost, according to Nimzovich, is to eventually provoke a pawn, for instance this C pawn, up to C6, which in turn will create a weakness here on D6. So let's look at this. So knight D5, rook B8, right? And you're gonna see what happens, because there's two things. This knight is very annoying here. So either you trade it off, right? And notice what happens. Let's see it in your head. If you trade this off, right? First of all, you're giving up your remaining bishop, and white has two choices. He can either come in with a piece and continue to try to provoke this move, or he can simply take with the pawn and utilize his rook on the c file and put pressure on a new target. Alright? So outposts are very useful because this guy has to go. So usually that results in some kind of weakening, or some kind of domination of the adjacent file here. So let's see what happens in this game. So rook b8, queen d2, knight e7. So now we see black fighting for this square. Rook fd1. So with this bishop and knight here, black guarantees that pretty much another piece won't be coming to this square, unless perhaps maybe move like bishop here or something like that. But even so, the only piece that will eventually be there is the queen. So rook fd1, a6, and bishop f3. Okay, queen d7, queen c3, and this is all designed that if there's a trade on d5, that black will have an attack down the c file. Rook e c8. So got to protect that pawn. Again, I'm always talking about opposition. Notice the rook on c8 opposed to this queen here. So you might say, hey, there's a whole bunch of stuff in between. What's the danger? It's always a good policy to move out of such situations, because what happens a couple of moves down the road, there'll be some type of tactic available because the queen is standing here. So like most strong players, they see that and they just get out of dodge. So queen a3, the rook moves back, e8, because black is basically trying to hold this position right here. He's at a disadvantage, but his position is not structurally weak. So he's kind of basically on a wait and see policy right now. So it's white that kind of has to show, that he has something in the position, or black will be content to shuffle around. So floor decides to advance e4. Okay, which leaves the dark squares that here on d4 unprotected. But hey, there's no way that black can really do anything with that right now. All right, so he just takes more space. And now finally, bishop takes d5. So black decides to make something happen. Now, of course, there's going to be no piece replacing d5. So this is why black figured it's a good time to capture here. Because you remember before with this bishop here, if this exchange took place now, then at the end there would probably be a rook here. Okay, but after e4, this bishop's blocked off. So now there will be no piece coming here because of this knight will win the exchange if the rook tried to come. So bishop takes and c takes, right? That's a good move. Now this bishop is a little, little awkwardly placed and will have to be repositioned at some point. But white has something to work on now. And of course, this is our backward pawn. All right. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say black has no compensation for this weakened pawn. What he has now is this knight is better than the bishop here. If he can get to these squares, his knight will be fantastic. So he has a mobile knight. Let's continue. So knight g6, g3, right? Keep him off of that square at least. Rook e7, and of course, black wants to play against this square, or this pawn rather. And we see the same thing. Notice the build up against this square, right? To keep this pawn here, and black has this one, and white wants to play against that. So queen b4 and knight f8. Okay, and of course black's counterplay, as mentioned, is against the e pawn. Rook d2, knight h7, and this is all about redirecting against here. Rook dc2, queen d8, bishop g2, and the idea is to free this bishop, right? White recognized the bishop is bad, and to free it from the defense by playing g2 and then f3, so another pawn can just guard it. Knight f6, f3. So now knight e8, queen d4, knight f6, and of course probably jump back here. So now here's the repositioning of the bishop. So now the bishop is on a great diagonal. Okay, so white has solved like the first part of his problems. The first part was the e pawn was a little weak, so he took care of that with the f pawn. The second part of the problem was the bishop was bad here, and he took care of that. So now knight e8, rook c3, king f8, and rook b3. Okay, now there's a threat here, queen e7, and winning his pawn. So what you see is that the siege against the c pawn wasn't enough. Black has his pawn adequately defended, so he's just probing, right? He's probing around. Notice that he's not weakening his position by making all kind of unnecessary pawn moves. He's moving around with the pieces, putting the pieces in good aggressive squares, and now he's just probing to force black to make some kind of concession. So with that threat of queen a7, b6. So now you got another target here. Rook to a3. You might say, so what? He plays rook a8. Queen c4 again. So queen c4. And now he provokes the move a5. So you might say, well, what's the big deal? Well, now there's more squares for for white to occupy here. And now this pawn on c7 is really weak. Okay, so there's always got to be a piece, watching. So okay, at the a5, right, the job is done. So the rook moves back. Right, still, how is white gonna break through? There's still no way to break through. Rook a7. Just black is defending. Black has a crappy position, but he's holding. Sometimes it's like that. Queen d4. Okay, because there's no use in the queen being in the front, right? Knight f6. And now a3. Okay. So now recognizing where your breaks are. Here's one break right here for white, that is. Here's another break. Okay, but white does not want to make this break because black will definitely gain counterplay after these pawns move like that. So that's something that you don't want to do. So looking at the breaks, this is the break you want to make. He plays a3. And again, if you don't understand about the breaks, actually, I don't know if I made a video on closed positions. I think I did a long time ago. I might have to do one to check. But yeah, it's very important. On closed positions is one of the main things is finding an open file for the rooks. But anyway, let's go on 39. So after 39 a3, all right, 98 queen a4. You see all the little subtle moves here. This rook is unprotected, so b4 is coming. Knight f6. Queen c2. King g8. Okay, so the bishop has been here for a while. Now the bishop goes here. Okay. So why is the bishop going there? The idea behind this move is to reposition the bishop to b5. That way the knight can be cut off, because this knight would love to try to end up here. Okay, so for instance, if black could get, say, like a move like a4 in, knight d7 in here, then he doesn't really have to worry about b4 too much, kicking the knight off. Okay, so this is what's going on. These little subtleties. Queen d7. So black takes over the diagonal that white has just vacated, and he stops this move. Okay. And of course, you have to see this beforehand, because if you just do it without, calculating, then it looks foolish. But notice the queen takes away this square from the knight. And now rook c6. So this move is possible again. So it gets out of there. Queen d8. Bishop b5. King f8. Rook c3. King g8. Notice the shuffling going on. h4. All right. Now, this move will fall under a different category, and that's of maneuvering. All right. And basically what's going on here is that when you have positions like this, your opponent is defending very, very stodgy, putting up a stodgy defense. You have to prepare, a situation on the board where you can attack on both wings. Okay, so the attack on the queen side alone is not enough. Black is too solid. If you notice, he's defending all the threats, whether it's going from knight e8 to knight f6. He has his rooks on a7 to e7. Queen on, he's not going to win that pawn with just a direct, just lining up his pieces, because the numbers don't lie. There's an even number of attackers, even number of defenders. So therefore, you have to try to prepare an attack on the opposite wing. So you're trying to create like basically another weakness, so that the opponent will not be able to defend both weaknesses at the same time. This takes patience and skill, right, to develop. You right. It's not something that you're just gonna know like overnight. You gotta go over a lot of games to understand. Because some of you are saying like, wow, well, H4 doesn't really threaten nothing, this and that, right? It just takes space. It's just a space grabbing move. Okay, so with White pretty much maxed out on the queen side, he just shifts his attention to the other side. So Queen C7, Queen C8, King H2, stopping the infiltration. Some more shuffling. King F8. So he comes back. Bishop F1. Queen D7. Bishop H3. Queen E8. Queen D2. Queen D8. Queen C2. Queen E8. King G1. Again, it's frustrating. It's like, man, how can you, that's why I love looking at these games, because these masters, man, they lay the foundation. If you study their games, you study their games, you'll see a lot of the techniques that they pioneered in today's games. King G8, Bishop F1, Queen D7. Matter of fact, a lot of these guys today might have shook hands already. So now, B4. All right. And like they say, pressure busts pipes. So after B4, Yana play A takes B4. And I think that this favors White, because he should have kind of tried to stick to like that maneuver, that waiting games. But he figured maybe he gets the open file or get some counterplay. But usually what happens is that if you're the defender and you open up the position, usually that will favor the player that's set up better, that has his pieces coordinated, which in this case is White. So after A takes, knight E8, Queen B2, Queen A4, and this is, of course, no doubt Black's plan. Black says, hey, taking over the file, Bishop C4, more shuffling, Rook B1, Queen D7, Bishop F1, Queen A4, Rook C, C1. And now we see the plan to take over the A file now from Black. Queen D7, Rook, Rook, Rook. Okay, so now we see that we see the reason that was a mistake for Black, because now the open file is falling into the enemy hands. And he took with the queen, by the way. So back to shuffling. Queen D8, Queen C3, Knight F6, Bishop B5, Queen C8, King G2. We see a lot of the same maneuvers, but with now we have an open file for White. And very, very, very powerful move by White here. Can you see the threat here? There's a positional threat and a tactical threat. Okay, the tactical threat is just queen takes B6, because notice the queen is unprotected. All right, so that's the tactical threat. The positional threat is Rook A1 to a8. So f5, rook a1, f takes, and he gives up the queen. No choice. He's hoping for this. And after g4, of course, there's a couple of other moves that can be played. Black resigned. So that was a long game. Thank you for your patience, but I felt it necessary to, for you to see the siege, against the backward pawns. And what I liked about it was that both sides had backward pawns in the game. And notice how white secured his backward pawn. Remember, he did the move f3 early in the game, right? So he rendered, and f3 is very useful in a lot of openings. You'll see that a lot. And yeah, the move f3 right there secured white's pawn chain in the center and set his bishop free, where unfortunately for black, he never had the same opportunity. His pieces were stuck guarding that pawn. But even with the positional deficiency, he still made it very difficult for difficult for white to break through. And it was only after this move that took place here, b4, which where white really was able to end the game quickly once the position came open. Okay, so let's look at another example. And this game is between Geller and Najdorf from Zurich, 1953, the famous tournament I was talking about. Geller has the white pieces, and this is a good game. Hopefully after this video, you know all you need to know about the backward pawn. Because any examples you're going to see after this, even in modern games, it's all going to come back to one of these games. That's why I'm showing you different examples. And we see Najdorf playing the Najdorf. Bishop e2. And this variation, a lot of people don't play this because it's not real aggressive. This is one of the favorites of Karpov in his heyday. Let's play bishop e2 as opposed to, this barn burning variation, bishop g5. Bishop e2, e5, right? Normal response even today. Knight b3, and we see backward pawn and weak d5 square on the board. Bishop e6, and we see the struggle immediately. Knight on f6, bishop e6, queen on d8, all teaming up to take control of d5. Castle, knight b, d7, f4, and this is all like old theory. Queen c7, f5, bishop comes here. Okay, now the advantage, right, of the pawn advancing to f5 for white prevents black from ever playing f5. Remember, in the first game, I showed you the scenario where black gets this f5 in and tries to undermine this pawn and all of that. So that's one advantage. The disadvantage is that a move like f3 is no longer available. Remember, in the last game, f3 was used to solidify white's weak e-pawn. Well, with the pawn on f5, that's no longer available. So this pawn has to be watched by pieces. Okay, so black has to try to profit from that somehow. So that's the question: can he or can he? Just like white has to try to profit from this. Okay, let's keep going. a4, rook to c8, bishop to e3, Excuse me. And now you have bishop e7. Okay. Now, what's going to happen here, because now this move seems normal, right? But watch what happens afterward. Now, Euwe um, recommends b6, right? Which, to me is up for grabs, but I understand the logic behind it. Because what happens after bishop e7, white plays a5, and now this pawn, excuse me, the b6 square becomes weak also, right? This pawn is also backward. So now you have these two squares under heavy scrutiny. So after a5, h5, bishops get traded off. Rook a4, hitting the queen. The queen drops back to c7. h3 and h4. And you have like these old time plans. Okay, so now you have all kind of backward pawns in the game. Okay, because now white's g pawn is backward. All right. Now the thing is, and this is the dynamic aspect of chess coming in, is can you exploit that square, right? There's weaknesses, right? But can you exploit them? And if you can't exploit them, are they really weak? At this point, the problem with the move like knight h5, of course, is giving away this square. Because soon as this guy goes, the knight on c3 will be happy to hop in there. So black has to be careful with the timing of that. Rook f2. And now b5. Okay, so Naidov, is like a feisty kind of dude. So he doesn't want to be patient. So he just strikes out. All right. Okay, so now it might, I can't see no real, better continuation, because if he doesn't try to lash out, then, rook d2 is coming, bishop g5, undermining this d5 square, and along with bishop takes f6. So he's kind of figuring, if I don't do something now, I'm going to just get ground down positionally. So he plays b5, a takes, knight takes, and then Geller plays bishop takes b6. All right. Now, in these kind of positions, when you're giving up the bishops, you always have to ask yourself, what's more valuable, the bishop or the knight? Now, this type of position, the knight is probably more valuable because, the bishop can't really be brought to, to bear on d5. This bishop can't do nothing to influence the square, but remove a defender. So, that's really the reason, is that the bishop can't have any influence on that important square except removing the defender. And that's what Geller decides on. Because notice after knight b6, there's more pressure there. And this move, rook takes a6, is possible, but then you had knight c4. Right, and then say after bishop c1, for example, queen b7. Can be a bit annoying. And of course, bishop c1 is not the only move. You do moves like queen c1, but then things can get real sharp quickly after knight takes b2. So this is why Geller avoided that move. He simply played bishop takes, queen takes, and now Queen e2 is played, renewing the fire over there. Rook a8. King h2, getting out of that pin castle. Rook f1, so it's back to work for the rook. Rook a7, anticipating the doubling up against this pawn here. Rook 1a2. Bishop to d8. Knight a5. Rook c8. Knight c4. Queen c6. And knight e3. And we can see the focus on the d5 square. Alright. Now, just, food for thought to understand that this is the key to the whole position. If white had played a move like b3, then d5 is possible here. Instead, knight e3. a5. Rook c4. Queen a6. b3. It's important to hold this guy up. Bishop b6. Takes. And now knight d5. Knight takes, and we see the superior knight versus the inferior bishop here. Okay? The battle for d5 is won. Okay? So now the rest of the game is about the conversion, the actual conversion of that. And I'll skim through that quickly. Knight off played queen c5, rook a1, queen f2. No problem with the endgame for white. Rook f1, and bishop d4. c3 here. g4, right? Why g4? You got to get this guy into the game. H takes, king takes, rook b7, rook b1, f6. Now, if a4, b4, and then follow quickly by rook a1. So that's why that move did not happen. So f6, king f3, king f7, king to e2, rook to b8, b4, and now g6, and trying to exploit this opposition that they right now the piece cannot be captured. And here Geller just played king d3. Max Euwe points out after f takes g6, king takes g6, and bishop takes c5, that white could have won in that manner. Rook takes c6, rook b8, and c7. And then after rook e8, you got the fork. Okay. So he played king d3 and took a little bit longer route, but his position is still better. c1, king g7, check, king h6, king e4, king g5, rook h7, and now white's threat is to play h4 check, and then after king g4 to grab this f pawn. So bishop f2, rook g7, check, king h4, king f3, of course threatening mate if king takes. Bishop e1, and now king g2. This threatens checkmate also at the rook g4. At the rook g4 check, king h5, knight f6, king h6, and then rook g6. That would be mate. So he guards this square, rook f8, but this pawn is running wild. No choice but to give it up. Again, back in the d5 square, and black just resigned. Okay, after rook b2, king f3, rook b3, king e4, rook takes h3. White just simply plays knight takes f6, and then rook g6 mate, which is analogous to the variation I showed earlier. So again, that was just another excellent example of playing against the pawn on d6, the backward pawn on d6. Okay, the whole game pretty much revolved around that. You know, even though again there were subplots going on, White made sure that the advance was never achieved by black, or control of that square was never gained by black, even to the end of the game. Even while he was attacking this pawn on the a file, d5 was never an option here. You can see how everything revolved around the domination of d5. Okay. Let's keep it moving. Now I'm going to show you an example of black, playing a little bit better here. This game is between Wolfgang Unziker and Mark Taimanov from the game in 1952. So again, Sicilian, d6, bishop e2, e5, and there it is again. This time, Unziker just simply went back to f3. You don't see this that much. It's just an equal position. Not bad. Just a chess position. h3, but the focus is right here. Okay, so bishop f1. So we can see that White has played pretty passive and allowed black to equalize quickly. Might be trying to just play for a draw or just avoid any kind of preparation from the opponent. Black expands on the queen side. Of course, we see this typical pressure against this pawn right here. But along with that pressure, remember, is the idea of controlling the d5 square. e3, rook c8, bishop b2, and now we have rook to c7. All right. So we can see the obvious point is to prepare to double the rooks on the c file. Okay. Now the other, more subtle idea is to put more pressure on this diagonal right here. Again, on the d5 square, and subsequently e4 by moving the queen over. So queen to a8, rook to c8. Okay? Remember, keeping the key idea in mind, which is the control of d5. So knight b1. Okay? Queen a8. Knight bd2. Knight d8, and this unleashes the battery of queen and bishop. So bishop d3, knight e6, rook c1, and there it is, rook f c8, knight h2. Okay, so now with this, all of this pressure, right, down the c file on the diagonal, this all keeps white like on a defensive, and that's like the penalty for playing too passive. So now white is basically on, totally with his back up against the wall here. And being, in this sorry state of affairs that he is, the idea behind this move is to try to protect this pawn, right? Reinforce this pawn with this playing a move like f3. And, to play that at this point in the game is to really, admit that something is wrong in your position. Knight d7, knight hf1, knight dc5, so more pressure. Knight g3 and g6, and that's just to stop knight f5. So now he plays knight e2, bishop g5, so now you have this pin here, knight c3, knight d4, and there's a good threat here. Alright, the threat is knight takes d3, then after c takes d3, simply removing the bishop, and I'm just doing it like this so you could kind of follow it in your head instead of me just showing you the variations. Then you will remove this guy, and with this pawn out of the way, then you have knight b3 here. So I'll show you. After, say, a no move like this, you can have knight takes d3, c takes d3, bishop d2, queen d2, and now you see the fork. Okay, so that's the threat right there, the knight d4. Therefore, knight c b1 is played. Okay, now the problem with all this defending is that it just simply allows this move d5. Now, better is just simply taking right here with knight d takes b3. Sorry, knight d takes b3. Of course, if pawn takes, then this just loses right on the spot. So therefore, this is the only move. And you can see there's nothing that white can do. The idea is if c takes b3, then there's nothing that white can do to save himself. So objectively, that was the better move. But for purposes of our lesson and what was actually played in the game, was a good move, which was d5, because at least we can see this, the steady logical sequence of planning going on. How he took over this, set up his pieces for this advance and the taking over of the d5 square. And here we see the success. Okay, and this advance of this pawn is made possible by the pressure of the black pieces on the square in front. Remember, the square in front of the backwards pawn is the important square. In this case, d5, and all that pressure was put on d5 by black, and now he takes it over. So now, after e takes d5, we see knight takes d3, c takes d3, rook takes c1, bishop takes c1, and bishop d5. Alright. So, what's great about this game is that black, basically up to now has been demonstrating that his own backward pawn wasn't at a disadvantage. Now it's going to show white that his backward pawn is a great disadvantage, which in fact is this isolated d pawn. Okay, so what's great about this game is that you get to see in one game the good and bad of the backward pawn. So we see the circumstances that are necessary to make the backward pawn look good, and that is the activity, dynamic placement of the pieces, in the control of the square in front of the pawn. That's the most important part. If you can control the square in front of the backward pawn, then you can see the effective use of it. If you don't control the square in front of the backward pawn, then it's bad. So you can see in this game, white's backward pawn is bad. It's blockaded, and there's no piece activity for white. Alright, so let's wrap this game up. So f3 was played. Rook c2. And this is a desperate looking kind of move. a4 was played. If rook takes here, then black has just too many things in his favor, and he can win with bishop takes. If g takes, rook takes c1. Right? While rook takes c1, it distracts the queen from the defense of f3. And then check. And of course, if knight here, then the queen will drop like that. So it's just too much, too much for white to deal with. He plays this a4, then after b4, king h1, queen c6. White just resigned, and Euwe points out there's hardly a move left for him to make. Speaking of Unziker, so this was a very powerful game, demonstrating both the good and bad side of the backward pawn. Now, I'm going to show you, this is the last thing you need to know about the backward pawn in this game, because I haven't showed it to you yet. And this is about a screen backward pawn. And a screen backward pawn is when, say for instance, let's see, hold on. I'll show you the screen, like, you know what I mean. Let's just go back. Okay, let's say for example, let's see, I want to follow the game here. Okay, let's say for example here, right, in our last game. Now white played this move, b3, but let's say for example he played knight d5, and then after knight d5, e takes d5, and let's say the knight went back to b8. Now this pawn is backward, but it's screened by the white pawn on d5. So that's what we mean by a screened backward pawn. All right, and screened backward pawns kind of like have like a different characteristic, because now you're not really playing against that pawn so much. I mean, there's really um, really no way, no way to get to it. Okay, so so that's the main idea. So once the pawn is blocked, it's kind of like the strategy changes, for both sides. So you have to be careful when making that type of decision. Like, don't allow this and then still try to play against that pawn, or with these ideas of, oh, let me take over the square. I mean, it's already done. All right, since it's blocked. So and I mean, it's a question whether you would even refer to that black pawn on d6 as a weak pawn any longer. Okay, so in this kind of position, the play is really dictated. In this type of position, the play is really dictated by the pawn majorities here. Okay, black usually has it's 4-3 on the queen side, right? Right, 4 pawns to 3, and then white has the same ratio on the queen side. Okay, right against these pawns, and if you look again, let me take away all these arrows. Now, if you look at this position, right, I just mentioned the majorities to you. If you look at this positions, whose majority would it be easier, to get going? And, it should take you, if you have, some basic chess knowledge, it should take you a second to answer that it is black who has the easier majority to get going, because he can get f5 in with no problem. Whereas for white, it's harder for him to get this advance going, right? He might not even get c4, c5 in. All right, with black, it's easy to get f5 in. So, be mindful of just allowing this to take place in your game. So with that in mind, we're gonna look at this last game, and then with this video, albeit kind of long, you have everything you need to know about backward pawns. So this game is from 1955 between Pilnik with the white pieces and again Geller with the black pieces. e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, d4, c takes, knight takes, knight f6, knight c3, d6, bishop e2, e5, knight b3, bishop e7. There it is. Castles, castles, bishop e3, bishop e6. Notice the build up on the square in front of the pawn. Bishop f3. And white is mindful, trying to play against it. a5. And knight d5. Okay. So white makes this decision to go for the space advantage on the queen side. And again, this is like almost like a different subject matter, but the reason why I'm using this game here is because it occurs in backward pawn games. Sometimes the opponent chooses to go into this, but it's really, the play is kind of different than what we've been showing. Right? And it's good to go over these games where you see this structure occur to see how the play goes. But again, like I said, it's about majorities. So white makes this decision because he's deciding that he's going to play against this weakened queen side. Okay, so bishop takes d5, e takes d5, the knight drops back, and now c4, knight a6. Alright, so everything is in plain sight. White has to advance his queen side majority. Black has to advance his majority on the queen side. Okay, now again, as I pointed out, it's much harder for white to get control over this square. Right? Look at all the firepower that black has against c5. You know, one of these rooks or both of the rooks eventually go to the open c file. Whereas for black, to get in f5, all he does is have to, you know, move this knight. So bishop d2. Now, again, the majority is supposed to be getting pushed here. So this move is kind of like, you know, like a wandering move. It's not in accordance with the needs of the position. Perhaps a move like knight d2 should be made. Why? Clearing the way for the advance of these pawns. Okay, so for example, knight d7. Again, black preparing that, guarding that. Okay, bishop e2 now, f5 and then f3. Okay, and then of course b3 with the idea of a3 and b4. That's how white should be trying to play that. Again, the position is equal. All right, so instead, move 14, bishop d2 was played. I'm sorry, not bishop e2, but bishop d2 was played. So, you know, it's kind of bizarro, this move right here. But it's like a one move threat here. And black just simply plays b6 here. This move is also interesting because a4 kind of slows white up too. But perhaps you're playing moves like that. But I don't know. After knight a5, knight c5, say b4, a takes, this might work out better for black, actually. There's a double-edged position there. Black just opted for the simple b6. Again, he kind of slows up the majority of white. So now bishop c3, knight c5, knight takes c5, bishop takes c5. And to me, white is drifting rather, because the thing is, if you know anything about majorities, pawn majorities, if the player whose majority gets crippled or stopped for any reason, usually is at a great disadvantage. Of course, the caveat being, you know, he has some kind of other compensation, but all other things being equal, if that majority is crippled, it usually ends up at a great disadvantage. Here, queen e1 was played. After the move queen d3, g6, bishop e2, knight d7, f4, and f5 is possible. And black gets his majority going. Queen E1, Knight D7. Again, Bishop D1 and A4. All right. The reason behind this move is it prevents this bishop from getting to A4. Okay. So A4 stops that. So bishop C2. And now F5, Rook D1. And still a little slow here. White probably had to play a move like F4, again trying to cripple majority. Then what the idea is, if E4, then you play G4, undermining this pawn. Okay, so after F5, Rook D1, G6, Queen E2 was played, Bishop F6, F3, E4, Bishop takes, Queen takes, F takes E4, and this is a positional pawn sacrifice. And again, back in 1955, this type of moves were amazing. Now they're more commonplace. It's sacrificing the pawn for access to the E5 square. Okay, so here's what Euwe has to say. It says, Black's pawn sacrifice has brought him a whole string of positional advantages. One, his 3-2 majority on the king side is now extremely active, as you can see. He controls E5 square. That's what I was talking about. That positional pawn sacrifice is now commonplace. It reminds me of another game I think I went over a long time ago between Mikhail Botvinnik and Arturo Pomar, where, matter of fact, yeah, I do. I have a video just on the positional pawn sacrifice, so check that out. Right, so he controls the vital E5 square, and of course he could put the knight there as a very strong piece. And 3, the white bishop is inferior to the black knight. Notice how suspect this bishop is. Pawns blocking him in, rook blocking him in, and then black has his own sentry blocking the white bishop. And so let's conclude this video. Let's go on. Rook F2, Knight E5, Rook DF1, Queen H4, Bishop D1, Rook F7, Queen C2, right? Trying to keep this guy tied up. G5. Now it's looking like a King's Indian, right? G5. And that's why it's good to know your structures, because it doesn't matter what opening it is if you know how to play the structure. Queen C3. The key thing to notice here is what happens once you make that allow that exchange on D5. So you're playing against a backward pawn and you decide to allow that pawn to be screened. Remember, this is going to turn into a battle of majorities here. The key thing to know about this game beside that is notice how white never gets his majority going. Okay, but black does. Look at those pawns just rolling. Model game. Again, another sacrifice here. Rook takes. Rook takes. Right, and this is based on this idea. You have the queen here, so he's trying desperately to, whoops, sorry about that, desperately for some counterplay here. Now, this is what black. I don't know. Actually, I'm not gonna say white miscalculated here, but he really had no choice. So now, knight f3, nice interference move. Cause notice now, this is check, and the guardian of this pawn, which was this queen here on c3, is blocked. So now this can be taken, right? If bishop takes, and the queen just takes. So he just plays king f2, right? So the king guards it, but now this happens, and now g takes, g4. Now you have this again powerful pawn, and what a beautiful way to end the game, right? We're talking about majorities. King f2, and you find the move here. What do you think black did here? Okay, remember, black is down a piece. Okay. Oh, come on. Don't tell me queen takes queen here. Alright, I'll give you the answer. Geller, a great tactician in his own right, played the move queen h2 with this idea discovery check, and Pilnik. Geller played queen h2, and Pilnik was forced to resign. There is no defense. Okay? There's no defense here to the queen of the pawn. If queen g3 check, then just simply queen takes g3, king takes g3, and queen g1. So that is it for our little segment on the backwards pawn. So I know that that brought back a lot of memories going over this material again, and I hope that it helps you guys look at the backward pawn in a different light. Just to summarize this game real quick again, if you're white and you're thinking about going in this type of position, remember that the characteristics change, and that it's all about the majorities here. And if you calculate that you can't successfully push this majority, then don't going for this type of plan. Here, white had chances to do it, but kind of mismanaged his time a little bit, and end up in a position where black was all over him, and he never got his majority going. As you can see, in this little recap of the game, and this was the killer move right here. And again, this is where black resigned. So I hope you enjoyed that video. I hope it enhances your game, and I'll see you soon on the next video. Press the like button, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you later.